and
good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sorry for the delay.
No, not at all. Just a private session. Laura will shout at us when we're going to go live. But I just thought it might be sensible to, given that we've got speakers on Zoom and yourself in the room, just to run through what's going to happen. I think Laura is going to do a very brief how this is going to work introduction at the start of the session. Then I'm going to do a very brief introductory presentation in which I will refer to all three of you speakers, and then I'll just set out the scene a bit. And then we'll come to each of you in turn for your introductory remarks. We've sort of allocated about 5 minutes each. And then after that, we'll go to a moderated Q&A. We've got some, in case questions are slow, we've got some possible questions. But Laura and I, between us on WhatsApp, are going to try and moderate and make sure that if there's a whole series of questions that they're grouped for you into some sort of logical sense. And we're planning to close at 9:30 UK time, 10:30 CST. So I think that's it. Any questions before we get going?
I'm fine. I think we can go on.
Great. Thank you very much. Laura, was there anything else you wanted to say to us before we go live?
No, not at all. Actually, thank you very much. I will just do a very quick introductory remark about this event. What's next for the DMA in partnership with a longtime partner of ours, actually Microsoft. So thank you again for your support, Carel, and your whole organization. Really looking forward to this discussion today. So just really briefly from me on the more logistics side of things, if anyone from the audience in person has a question at the end, when we get to that point, please do come up to the stage so that you can be seen online. I'll give you this microphone. If there's any questions from online participants, please do put them in the Q&A box there, and we will group them accordingly if there were a lot. But yeah, that's all from me. So thanks once again to Baroness Salbrinton for chairing this event, and I'll leave it to her to introduce herself, the panel, and her introductory remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organised by the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in Europe. I'm Sal Brinton, and I'm one of the vice presidents of ALDE. Today's session is a hybrid one. We have some speakers and audience in both the room and on Zoom. I'd like to start by thanking Laura, Daniela, and Leo, and other colleagues at ALDE for setting this webinar up, and especially to Microsoft for their sponsorship. I'm pleased to say we have 3 expert speakers with us today. I'm delighted to welcome in the room with Laura, member of the European Parliament and member of the Renew Group, Ondřej Kovařík, and with me on Zoom, Carel Maske from Microsoft and Steve Thomas from the Kelkoo Group. The Digital Markets Act introduces rules for platforms that act as gatekeepers in the digital sector, highly topical at the moment and a complex issue that is going to take some getting into, I think. These platforms have a significant impact on the internal market, serve as an important gateway for business users to reach customers, and which enjoy or will enjoy in the future an entrenched and a durable position. This can grant them the power to act as private rule makers and to function as bottlenecks between businesses and consumers. The Digital Markets Act, DMA from now on, aims at preventing gamekeepers from imposing unfair conditions on businesses and consumers and at ensuring the openness of important digital services. Some examples of these conditions that gatekeepers sometimes impose include prohibiting businesses from accessing their own data when operating on these platforms, or situations where users are sometimes locked into a particular service and have limited options for switching to alternative services. Common rules across the single market will foster innovation, growth and competitiveness, and facilitate the scaling up of smaller platforms, small and medium-sized enterprises and startups who will have a single clear framework at an EU level. So as the European Parliament and Council continue to form their positions on the European Commission's DMA proposal, it appears increasingly possible that the final text will see a significant expansion of both the scope and the list of obligations. But with such far-reaching and ambitious text in a complex and fast-moving digital environment, how can we ensure that its enforcement delivers optimal solution for all stakeholders? That's the simple task we have ahead of us to discuss today. So I'm delighted now to welcome for their opening remarks the three speakers. And we'll start, please, with Ondřej Kovařík, who is a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Renew Group. Ondřej.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a big pleasure to be with you this morning and to discuss such an important file. I think, as you rightly pointed out, it's one of the key provisions in terms of digital legislation that was put forward by the European Commission at the end of last year, and we are currently dealing with it on the level of member states on one hand and on the level of European Parliament. Actually, as we speak, my colleagues are voting in Libe committee on the opinion that we were drafting to the Digital Markets Act on behalf of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Internal Affairs, and I hope it will be adopted, and it will actually complete the work of three other committees giving opinion and one lead committee, which is an internal market committee that is planning to conclude its negotiation by actually next month. So we will see the position of the European Parliament quite soon. But just a couple of remarks to start the discussion on the DMA in the broader context of digital legislation. As it was already said, there are obviously big challenges in terms of regulatory reaction on the deep changes that took place mainly in the digital sphere during the last years, and we can only say that during the pandemic, all these changes and the market trends that we saw were only accelerated by events and also by the way that the business activities could have been carried out. I think the importance of DMA, which I would locate in the middle of other legislative proposals such as Digital Services Act or Data Governance Act, which I think both very important pieces of legislation in terms of regulating the digital services. The Digital Markets Act is, let's say, quite a simple one in terms of what is the main target, what is the main goal. And it's actually to set rules that are predictable, that create a framework that is actually foreseeable in terms of, let's say, market behavior of some of the biggest players in the field. And I think this is something that we were discussing for quite a long time on the European level. We've been witnessing the Commission fighting through the competition files with some of the digital services providers, the big platforms, on various competition issues, and I think we all sort of remember the headlines of how big the fines were imposed on some of the online services providers, but those were, let's say, all an ad hoc decisions based on the existing competition policy framework on the European level. And what DMA is trying to do is actually set a framework that is more forward-looking. So it sets clear set of rules that the business operators should respect in this regard. And I think this is the main change. I'm really glad that the proposal has been proposed together by the commissioners that are part of Renew Europe or ALDE party family. And mainly Margaret Vestager, but also Thierry Breton, that actually took I think a very reasonable approach, very pragmatic, and I think very well balanced in their proposal. So I think that is also maybe one of the questions that were raised in the introduction, is to what extent should we regulate? In what extent should we actually step in? And it was mentioned that the European Parliament is quite ambitious in terms of maybe broadening the scope and adding some additional elements to it. I think it's very likely. I don't have the latest update from the discussions in IMCO committee, but I can tell you from my discussions in LIBE committee that there is a will of MEPs actually to maybe clarify or bring more details into the proposal in some areas, mainly regarding the scope of the DMA. So what kind of services should be covered by the regulation, and also in terms of setting the obligations and requirements to those companies that would be defined and categorized as so-called gatekeepers. So those who are actually the main players on the market. So I think this will be concerns that the Parliament will raise in the debate. Just very quickly at the end, I was mentioning that the LIBE committee, we were mainly trying to focus on other issues related to the provision of digital services, such as the data privacy, the protection of data, the coherence between DMA and the digital legislation with the existing legislation, such as GDPR, for instance, which I think is a very important point. And also we had a lot of discussions, and I think this will be one of the main messages that the Parliament will send to next phase of negotiations, and we discussed quite a lot the issue of interoperability, what it really means, to what extent the gatekeepers should open up their services, their softwares, their algorithms, their data to other market players, so that they are actually not abusing their position, they are not locking in the customers, be it the regular customers like citizens like us, or be it the business users. They are not locking in them in one kind of solution, but they are also let's say compatible in terms of how the market works with other third parties services providers. So I think those were the main concerns that were raised. I think we are still at the beginning of the discussion. We are currently trying to have a consolidated position in the European Parliament, but I think we still have a long way to go in terms of reaching the final conclusion on the file. So I think that would be it for the introduction, and I'll be happy to go into details on some of the issues that you might be interested to discuss more in depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ondřej. And if I can turn now to Carel from Microsoft.
Thank you very much. Thanks for organizing this discussion, and Ondřej in particular, thanks for joining us. We had some discussions before. I know how intensely you and others are working on this file, and it's very much appreciated, because at Microsoft we think such regulation is overdue and are largely supportive of new rules and ex-ante rules that are made to tackle some of the most problematic issues we have seen over the past years unfolding, not just across Europe, but across the world. So we need that regulation. We are supportive of this and want this to be as effective as possible. And that's why, in particular, the issue you mentioned around scope is an important one which needs to be addressed. This should be about gatekeepers. This should be about the most serious problems we are facing. And it can't be the introduction of regulation of everything digital. There is indeed quite some political momentum to be ambitious. And nothing is wrong with being ambitious in tackling the problems, but there is a cost to it if it becomes overly broad, and if it covers issues that haven't been problems in the past and that haven't raised gatekeeper concerns previously. I fully understand that this regulation needs to be open to the future. It needs to be dynamic to react, but it can't be a one rule fits all and forever a kind of concept. And that's where we are coming from in our suggestions around, what needs to be done as we move this forward. There are certain areas, in particular in the area of cloud services, where the service providers don't act as intermediaries, and where we think it would be overreach if that was included and subject to rules which are too strict, which limit innovation as we go forward, and which randomly interfere with competition between the existing gatekeepers, and Microsoft will definitely be in scope, but also between those gatekeepers and new gatekeepers that might enter the market, and which is the ultimate goal of that game, that European players become more powerful in digital markets, that they seize opportunities that are there in a market that is still growing. We are implementing these rules already, or think about its implementation, because we know that there is an ambitious timing to this. And it's very challenging if you have to comply within a couple of months by changing business practices or even redesigning products as you want to comply with this. And as we are complying and see the multitude of services that are potentially covered, we also warn, by making it overly broad, you ultimately affect the effectiveness. And one more point before I close with some initial remarks, something which we see being raised more broadly, most recently by the German Monopolies Commission, is around efficiencies and some regulatory dialogue. If you have black and white rules, they may or may not work, depending on the circumstances. And as broad as the DMA currently is set up, and as broad as the rules are, there needs to be some argument to be made around efficiencies and whether these rules work in specific circumstances. And this is not to say we need to introduce competition procedures and years of discussion and litigation, but we need to find a process where we have stakeholders weigh in to find solutions, that it's not left to the gatekeepers, making the fox the guardian of the hen house in how implementation should look like. The Commission should have a strong voice in that process, and stakeholders should also get a voice. And with that, I look forward to the discussion of what needs to be done, what's next, pass it on, I think, to Steve.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Steve. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Just like to add my thanks to the thanks already to the organisers of this session. It's very nice to be invited to join the discussion, and also thank you to everybody really who's working on the DMA, including MEP Kovařík and everybody who I know is putting in a lot of hours thinking about very difficult issues. I will pick up a couple of the points that Carel has made, which I think are really important, and perhaps one extra. I think the first thing that's particularly interesting for me is the relationship between the scope of the DMA and the resource needed in order to effectively enforce it. And I think what we at Kelkoo are concerned about is that as the potential scope expands and other things come into that scope and other issues become part of what the DMA is trying to solve, that it becomes more and more difficult to see how it's possible for the Commission, with its proposed 80 FTEs, to make a dent in that and to do what it needs to do to effectively enforce the provisions and to solve the problems. And I think, therefore, what we need to be thinking is, as pragmatically as possible, how much can we actually do here, and what are the biggest problems that we're trying to solve, and to look then at what those biggest problems are and focus on those for now. I think our position probably differs slightly from Carel and Microsoft in that we don't necessarily see a problem with this as a starting point for digital regulation and a way to start that piece of work. But that is an enormous piece of work to try and do, and certainly we think too big to try and do in one go. And therefore, I think there's a concern on our side that the wider the scope gets, the more difficult it is to effectively enforce and to actually solve those problems that everybody is trying to solve. The second point, I think, is around the regulatory dialogue that Carel mentioned. Kelkoo, for those of you who don't know us, we're a comparison shopping service. We spent a large number of years and an awful lot of time talking to the Commission and pushing for a decision against Google in the Google Shopping and Google AdSense cases. And so our issues are really around search and equal treatment in search. And what we've seen in the Google Shopping case is ultimately what we consider to be a good, well-written decision with solid principles, but where enforcement has struggled really to do what it needs to do and to fix the problem. We think that could have been improved through regulatory dialogue, through talking to all of the market participants and Google at the same time about what would be an effective remedy in that case. How do you solve that specific issue? And we think that model is valuable not just in shopping or in search more generally, but in all these issues. Digital markets are dynamic, they move quickly, the problems change over time, and it's really important that enforcers understand exactly what is happening in order to be able to solve the problems that exist. And we think that the best way to get that understanding is to have an all-party dialogue and to hear from all sides of the debate, not just from the people who are complaining like us, but also from those who are being complained about, so that we can really thrash out the issues. And we think that that's the best way to keep everybody honest on all sides of the debate, and to get to resolutions as quickly and as efficiently as possible. That brings me on to the last point I wanted to mention, which is about speed of enforcement. And I think Carel also touched on that. There's not much use putting in a regulation which is so difficult to comply with that it takes years and years for organisations ultimately to come up to speed. And therefore, we think, linked back really to the point on scope, it's important at this point to focus on the biggest issues, on the things that are most problematic. And then once we've managed to deal with those, perhaps then we should consider whether there are new areas or additional areas that were lower priority at this stage, but which then need to be dealt with. But for now, again, coming back to that point about pragmatism, we have some huge issues to solve and we can't solve everything all at once. And therefore we need to prioritise and make sure that we do at least achieve dealing with the biggest issues now, rather than tying ourselves in knots trying to deal with everything. And that's all I wanted to say at this point.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you all three of you for doing a great scene setting for us. Could I say to those watching the webinar, if you want to ask questions, if you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature. And if you're in the room, could you use the old-fashioned way of waving your hand and letting Laura know? She identified herself at the start. Laura and I will try and manage virtual and real room dynamics as they go. And just while people are thinking about questions and getting them up, I'd like to open with a question following all three of your very, very differing opening introductions. We've heard from you how the DMA is increasing in scope and its obligations all the time. And Carel, you referred to the problems around clouds. And I just wondered if we run the risk of ending up with a document that's possible to enforce? And all three of you said you might talk about some more examples. It would be useful to help understand exactly where you think the problems of legislation for enforcement will sit as it stands at the moment. Could we start with Ondřej, and then I'll come to Steve after that? Thank you.
I hope I heard the question properly, because we had some connection issues. But in terms of enforcement scope, I think there's a good point that was mentioned by the previous speaker, and this is also, I think, where when I was speaking about a good balanced proposal coming from the European Commission, I think there was also one of the points where we can see that there were some considerations put into it in terms of how efficient the enforcement on the Commission level can be. And obviously, if we put too many obligations, too many requirements, and too many areas actually into the DMA, we can end up in a situation where when the regulation itself can be quite heavy and can be also quite difficult to enforce. Because I think if you look at it from the institutional point of view, we're currently discussing that the DMA would require from the Commission to set up a dedicated unit or directorate that will be in charge. That cannot be done in a small group of people, and also we have to really take care of what kind of expertise is actually required from those people who will enforce it. And when you look at some of the provisions in Article 5 and 6 of the DMA, where we discussed various practices and business practices, quite often very technical, I think that would also require expertise well beyond the let's say proper competition policy as we know it. There are provisions that are closer to other areas of expertise, such as telecommunication, for instance, but not only. So I think we should bear this in mind when trying to set the initial rules right in this regard, to make sure that it is actually efficient, and then that there is enough expertise on the institutional side to enforce it. And also one last point that I would like to raise in this regard, obviously, and also I think there would be preference for the European Parliament. Mainly, we obviously see the Commission to be the key place for enforcement of the DMA. But in various areas, there has to be a good cooperation with national level authorities, because I think without that, the enforcement would not be efficient enough. And I think there is an actually access to information that maybe the Commission can have easy access on some, but the national authorities can have, due to their competencies, can have better access to some else. So I think this is something that we should really take care of quite well when we discuss the final version of the proposal.
Steve, thank you very much.
So I'm not sure if it's just for me, Sal, but you've frozen. I will pick up at that point. I think I agree with both of those points that MEP Kovařík has made. I think expertise is vitally important. We see other regulators, other enforcement bodies upskilling with hiring people from industry or people with industry backgrounds who have whether that's certain technical skills or other skill sets which are going to be vital in this area. I think it would be impossible to improve enforcement, improve the situation, whether that's in terms of effectiveness or in terms of speed, without bringing in that expertise. And I think that the example that we see in the UK, for example, with the DMU being set up by the UK's Competition and Markets Authority is a good example. We think that that's a good way forward, and that Ultimately, this is, as you say, it's not just a competition regulation. It involves expertise in all sorts of deep and detailed areas of digital markets, and therefore, I think what we can't have going forward is competition experts taking a year or 2 years to understand a very detailed part of a market. Instead, what we need is people who can jump in and say, okay, I understand this, I've worked in it for a number of years, I know exactly how this part of it works. Yes, that proposed solution is good. No, that proposed solution probably won't work. The second part of that, I think, is the regulatory dialogue point. And I think that's where industry can help to augment the expertise and the knowledge that the Commission, we very much hope, will have, and potentially that the national competition authorities also will have, and that where new and interesting issues are coming up, industry can help to educate on those issues, and allow the Commission or the national competition authorities to take better decisions about enforcement and about solutions.
Very much, Steve. While we're waiting for Sal to come back and reconnect, I'll just take over. But perhaps, Carel, you also have something to say here on this question.
Yeah, I would like to dig a little bit deeper and think, about the efficiency of the enforcement, the resources that are available, and how that's linked to the scope, and the more ambitious proposals that are out there in broadening the scope. When I'm looking at Article 2 of the regulation, which includes the definitions and the definition of core platform services, you find a couple of services which are pretty obvious and kind of narrow in scope. Everyone knows what a search engine is, a social network, a video sharing platform, or an operating system. And then there's cloud, kind of coming last and including everything. And when we started to think about implementation of the DMA, we went through roughly 200 cloud services Microsoft has, and we're thinking about, whether we meet the thresholds or not, and what the user means and not. And here comes the challenge all of us, struggle with, and we are the experts kind of regarding these services. How do we apply these rules, make sense out of them, and come to a solution that's addressing potential problems? I think the discussion so far has focused very much on the problematic cases, and the proposal by the Commission has trying to put the problematic cases we experienced so far in the center of the regulation. And what I'm really worried about is I totally understand, the motivation behind making it ambitious, making it broad. But then if you think about not the problematic cases where we know there is a problem and have kind of an idea of an answer, but applying it to everything else where we don't know that there is a problem in the first place, think about whether there could be a problem, and then finding a solution, being completely unclear what that should look like. So there is a big risk in terms of, enforcement becoming vague. And the building the expertise that it's needed to find actually meaningful solutions. It's not good enough if we have some solution. We need to solve the problem, and that's why this focus in terms of scope, and then the point Steve made before around regulatory dialogue. Finding a solution with the experts to have something which actually addresses the concerns that businesses have and users have when they interact with large platforms.
Thanks very much, Carol. I've heard from Sal, she's completely fallen off the internet. She's trying to rejoin. She resorted to a text message to let me know. And actually it made me think of a question based on the last time I resorted to sending a text message, which was last Monday. You probably were all affected by the outage that affected Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And I just wondered, many of you have mentioned today overregulation, underregulation, but also monopolization from big companies. And I just wondered how an outage like that from such a dominant force in this field might affect perhaps this debate, if at all. Maybe we'll change the order up and start this time with Steve.
I think for me, what it did was really highlight the issue that we have, that so many people suddenly sat there and said, well, how do I do these things now? And those of us who are old enough to remember when text messages were the only way to do things that we now do with WhatsApp or Instagram direct messages or using Facebook, kind of look around and think, well, this isn't so difficult. But if your primary tool is WhatsApp or Facebook for communicating with people, then that suddenly becomes very difficult. I think what it did was just highlight the level of reliance that there is on those services, and the importance of alternatives. If we had reached a point, as we have in some areas covered by the DMA, where there are no alternatives, then how would things function? And therefore, for me, it just brings things into sharper focus. I don't think it necessarily changes the debate, but it highlights the importance and really brings it into focus.
Thanks so much. Carel.
Yeah, I totally echo what Steve was saying. You know, we don't want to end up in a world where we just have one provider. And I think the DMA should focus on areas where we have, no alternatives, to create room and opportunity. And that's the objective of competitiveness, not just the fairness aspect, but really changing the market into an environment where there is room for alternatives. And I think that's where, how you interfere with that market becomes critical. You want to level the playing field, but you don't want to randomly tip it one way or another. And one of the simple examples we keep giving, if you apply the same rule you apply to Google, you apply to Bing, where we have a few percent market share and trying to be an alternative, you might actually affect negatively competitiveness in that market. So there needs to be some control how you apply these rules, that they are not overreaching, as you are interfering also with the competition by one gatekeeper with another gatekeeper, and that one gatekeeper or that other gatekeeper might be the only alternative to bring actually a product to the market, be it an innovation coming from the gatekeeper or coming from other players in the market that a platform can bring to the market. We have tried to bring a mobile operating system to the market, and even as a gatekeeper or as a particularly strong digital company, we were not able to do that. And we are stuck with two operating systems. We are stuck with one search engine. I think that there are things that need to be done, but they need to be done carefully. So don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. As you interfere with these markets, the DMA is a strong tool. These rules are, in particular, if you think about interoperability, these are really intervening with the design, which creates opportunities, but also has risks in terms of, how companies can develop and how they can compete with other strong players in the market. So it's just a word of caution. Look, watch out what you wish for. These rules work in the instances for which they were designed, but they don't necessarily work for everything, and don't just produce the positive results as they interfere with free markets. They also have unintended consequences.
Thanks so much, Carel. And of course, last but not least, Ondřej.
Yeah, I think I would follow up the lines that were raised by the previous speakers. I mean, if you allow me to start on a light note, I think what it showed that that the Commission actually picked up a good denomination for gatekeepers, because this is what happened is that the gate was actually closed, so nobody was actually able to get in or out. And this is exactly what is happening on that market when there's a high concentration of the position of market position, but also of market power. And that's, I think, what the DMA would like to address, because as it was mentioned by previous speakers, there are negative effects that may be linked to the fact that some kind of services are provided by predominantly by one company or one group of companies, which I think is a risk. It's a risk for consumers, it's a risk for services they provide, but also it's what the outage actually also sort of pointed out indirectly. There may be a risk in terms of providing a high level of cyber resilience in this regard. So I think the idea is there. To follow up on the interoperability. Sure, I think that's why the discussion about it is very hard, because on one hand we are entering in the field of if you wish, business secrets of a company that is actually providing some kind of services. On the other hand, it's really about finding a good balance of not being locked into some kind of solutions and actually provide at least, for instance, access to data to other services providers. So I think that could be one part of the equation. But obviously, I think the main goal, as I mentioned at the beginning of the DMA, is to look at those business players that are predominantly occupying the market in particular service, and that there is a risk of abusing their position vis-a-vis other market players, and I think this is the main issue that should be the scope of the DMA and its enforcement in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. I see we've got Sal back, so I'm going to hand straight over to you, Sal, to follow up on any questions that you might have still for our speakers before opening up to the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, and sorry for that absolutely classic thing on digital Zoom about digital matters. My internet just completely fell over. Carel, a question for you. If there is just one thing that you want the European Parliament to pay attention to when discussing the DMA, what is it?
Yeah, I do have one thing, and actually a lot of others follow from that, but just don't have a look at the problematic cases. The focus of this DMA should be the problematic cases, that's right, but the regulation will apply throughout a large number of services, and think that through as well in the discussion, because you want to achieve contestability, you want to achieve more fairness. The example before around interoperability, it can increase contestability, but it can also reduce contestability. And I think all the other things following from that is then, you need to have some discussion about this. You need to have different perspectives on this to ensure you get to the right solution. So think comprehensively about what this will do to the market. It should and has to address the problematic issues, but it will be much broader as a regulation that applies to a large number of companies or a small number of companies. but definitely a large number of different services.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I have one for Ondřej as well. What should companies like Microsoft and other gatekeepers be doing right now to get ready for what's coming with the DMA?
I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry, Ondřej.
Yeah, I missed the beginning. Can you please repeat the question?
Of course. What, Ondřej? So, what questions? What should companies like Microsoft and other gatekeepers be doing right now to get ready for the DMA?
Well, I think well, it's hard to get it to send some advice to companies such as Microsoft. I think they have a lot of lawyers and experts who are currently working on that. But I think the key is actually to see, because obviously there's a number of companies that already know that will be defined as gatekeepers. So to see and go through their business practices, their contracts they have with the service provider, to see if there is a potential for clash with the new obligations and requirements that are set or will be set by the DMA. I don't think obviously there is a pressure to have the DMA in place as soon as possible, but at the same time, I think, and it's also our position, we would like to give some reasonable amount of time for the business operators to comply, because obviously we know that there are contracts that are currently in place. There are supply chains that are currently in place. So I mean, all these would need to require potential changes. So I think if I should put it in sort of a business speak, I think I would basically go through a DMA focused audit of activities that they are currently doing, the services they are providing, together with other suppliers or providers, contractors, to see what can be the potential point of non-compliance with the DMA, and to see how to address. And I have to say, on my behalf, I went through long hours of consultations with stakeholders, including potential gatekeepers, and I think they have very good overview of the regulation right now. They bring a lot of inputs and arguments to the discussion, and I think I mean, as the regulatory dialogue, for example, was mentioned here as well, I think this is also part of the important part of the exercise. So to keep the communication so that we can actually exchange on the way the DMA will be designed, so that we know that it is actually focusing on those issues that are the most important.
Thank you very much. I gather from Laura that we have a question from the floor in the press club. So I'm going to hand over to her with her microphone.
Absolutely. Please come forward so the camera can see you. Please introduce yourself and follow up by your question.
Hello, Elias Hanus from Broadcom. A question for the panel. You have been discussing about the challenges of the DMA, and it's interesting actually how the one thing links to the other. You know, the scope links to enforcement, the depth of the enforcement then links to the size of the team, and all these points. Several of the member states that have a DMA-like legislation have made particular choice. In the case of the UK, they either have it razor sharp in terms of the scope and the companies that it is addressing. In the case of Germany, we have both quantitative criteria that we see also in the DMA, but also qualitative criteria that we saw you sort of like alluding towards when you were raising points around competitiveness in the market and all that. Given the fact that we're probably not going down the path of razor sharp in terms of the companies that this is addressing, do you see a need for qualitative on top of quantitative criteria in order to address the scope question? Thank you.
Thanks. Perhaps we could hear from Ondřej first of all, as you are in the room, and then we'll come to Carel and then to Steve.
Yes, absolutely, and thank you for the question. It's actually a very good question on the key issue of DMA. So basically, what are the criteria so that the gatekeepers can be designated? And also, I think following up to what was mentioned earlier in terms of what kind of services the gatekeepers provide, so that it's actually it falls in the scope of the DMA. I think we had many discussions about the quantitative threshold in the parliament, and the discussions are not over. I'm part of those who at this point say that I think the way the Commission decided to design the quantitative criteria are fine, are well balanced. I think if we go too up, then we end up in actually addressing very small group of companies. If we go too down, then I think we actually go even against the very idea of the DMA. So we will really, end up in a very broad potential number of gatekeepers, which I don't think is a good idea. Also in terms of innovation, et cetera, et cetera. You mentioned the qualitative criteria. For instance, I was the one, but I didn't have the majority, to be honest. I wanted to focus on more detailed definition of how active end users and the business users are defined, because this is, I think, that's part of the quantitative criteria, but you can have qualitative differences, the way you define the end user. So for instance, my view would be to go a little bit more detail in the primary regulation, not to wait for the secondary legislation, the delegated act that the Commission will present, but to have at least more detailed definition, for instance, of the users, so that we have clarity on the designation process.
Thank you very much. Carel.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very good question around the qualitative criteria, and it leads back to what's at what stage am I looking at counterfactuals? At what stage am I trying to strike a balance? I think the qualitative criteria that are used in the DMA, which is around the gatekeeping function, the intermediation that a service makes a service ultimately a gatekeeper, is a very good and important one. For the example I mentioned before, look at Bing, we would have, we probably meet the qualitative criteria, even if they are a little bit higher, or anyway, if they are lower. But Bing is not a gatekeeper by no stretch of imagination. It would be if you compare it to Google search. So then you need to correct the outcomes, which are a result of fixed thresholds. You can also do that in the context of the obligations, and that then leads to the regulatory dialogue. They might be too broad, as they are applied to everyone, and then you need to cut back to make sure it's hitting the right cases and not covering everyone with obligations which are unnecessary, don't improve contestability and fairness, and ultimately deter markets rather than reintroducing competition into markets. Thank you.
And Steve?
I think that both Carel and Ondřej have hit the nail on the head there, really. The issue here, particularly as Carel says, is making sure that this applies to gatekeepers, but that it doesn't apply to non-gatekeepers. And that doesn't just mean at the level of an entire organization, it means at the level of the service that is being provided. Bing is one example, but there are many others of services that are provided by very large, very well-resourced organizations that have not been able to break into a given market and provide valuable competition. And I think the importance of focusing on gatekeeper services, not just whole gatekeeper organizations, is paramount to effectiveness, to useful enforcement, and to solving the problems that we have.
Thank you very much. There's just time if each of you want to make a brief concluding remark. And I'd like to start, please, with Ondřej, and then I'll come to Steve and then Carel.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, big thanks for having this debate. I think it's actually very important to discuss this particular piece of legislation from both sides. So not only from the regulators or legislators, but also from the side of the industry, because in the end of the day, those two sides will be those actually in charge. The businesses will have to comply with the requirements, and the regulators will have to enforce the DMA properly. So I think the message I'm taking with me from this debate is actually finding a good balance in terms of addressing those issues that are the most problematic in terms of the balance in the market power, the potential abuse of market power, but not to go too far, too broad in the way this is defined, because I think, and I share this view, it's not really about completely reshaping the markets. It is really about to enforce the rule of competition, the rule of actually let's say level playing field, if that is possible, but not to go too far beyond that. So thanks once again for this discussion, and I'm quite sure that we will have many others as the process of negotiating the final version of DMA is far from being over. So I'm looking forward to the next discussion on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. You next.
So I finish really by saying we've come an incredible distance in the last few years in terms of the understanding of the problems that we have in digital markets. When I started working on these issues, it felt like we were talking to a brick wall in some instances, and people just didn't really see what the issue was. A range of services that were available to consumers. Why were people like us complaining? And I think we've a very long way in getting that understanding. What I think we need to do now is to not let great be the enemy of good, and to make sure that we push forward and solve some of those problems if we can, and to not try to come up with the perfect solution to every problem at the first go. And I think that's really what I hope for in the next sort of round of the DMA negotiations, and that we can get to a point where at least some of these issues can be fixed, and then we can build on that.
Carel, thank you.
Yeah, I would only like to add to that. First of all, I'm looking very much forward, and I'm very grateful for having this discussion. I think indeed we came a very long way. We have a very good proposal out there, and now let's make that work. Let's work through the details of this. It's still a lot of work ahead of us to do so. And it's good that all the stakeholders are coming together to discuss what an effective solution to starting to solve these problems is. And I couldn't agree more with Steve. You know, let's focus on the things we can effectively do, and let's do them the best we can so that it makes a difference, instead of trying to be overly ambitious and then, you know, get lost halfway, given the magnitude of the challenge we are trying to address.
Thank you to all three of you. I think it's been an interesting debate, given the breadth of where each of you has come from, and yet a surprising commonality of comment about the big issues. And if dialogue is the best way of moving this forward as the bill progresses into Parliament, then that seems to me to be the best outcome that we can have. And I hope that it's replicated wider than just the audience here today. I'd like to thank each of our speakers, Ondřej Kovařík from the European Parliament and from the Renew Group, Carel Maske, who's at Microsoft, and Steve Thomas at the Kelkoo Group. I'd also like to thank Laura and her team for making this happen, and apologies for my technical outage in the middle of this. And I finally want to thank Microsoft for their partnership for not just this year, but in previous years. And we're really grateful for their input on a series of very interesting topics and not afraid to be challenged by other speakers as well. And I'm really grateful for all of that. So from ALDE, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.